All right. And
It's
in all
official.
seriousness, I've been advised by counsel to also ask out loud if everybody is okay with being recorded.
Yes.
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 We allowed lawyers into this project. We'll see how that works out.
Yeah, it's hard not to.
All right. I don't know if Brian's going to join or not, but I think we're in pretty good shape with participants. So I think we can and should get started. So I'm going to take, you guys don't need to see me. I'm going to go to a screen and take notes while I ask questions. So if we can, I don't think everybody knows everybody, but just in case, can we just do a real quick round table, round robin here, and just everybody say hi, who they are, and for Pat and Kel, why you think you're here.
That's a loaded one. Where would you like to?
Why don't you get started, Kel?
Okay.
Go.
Sorry, is me?
Oh, good. Jim St. Clair's here. Good, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Howdy, y'all.
Hi. So who did you want to have get started?
Actually, if I may, Dan, why don't you go first, and then you introduced us to Kel. So why don't you go first, and then introduce Kel so he can introduce himself.
You bet. Hi, Dan Chavez, Senior Consultant with Health Tech Solutions, formerly with San Diego Health Connect, formerly the Executive Director of the LEAP program. And as such, I had the great opportunity of meeting Cal and the Pyette team. So Cal, in my opinion, for what it's worth, is one of the globe's authorities on consent. He's done it in a variety of locations, and it's a pleasure to welcome him and Pat to our conversation. Cal, please.
Wonderful. And thank you. You're very generous. We've just been doggedly at this for so long, it seems silly. But essentially, my role within Pyette is business development and operations. Truthfully, Pat, who's on the line here, has been a wonderful resource, working with us for many years, almost all of the tenure that we've been at this. So I'll let Pat speak to his own competency, but in a thumbnail, we started in 2002, and because of the quirky name, wanted to be synonymous with privacy and security in the healthcare IT space. And looked to the HIPAA 03 and 05 compliance milestones as something to build out a solution to be an answer for. But of course, later finding out there were no HIPAA police and compliance was meh. And so here we are in 2021, speaking to you about, ideally about some of our experience, at least, in our path, which I won't agree with right now. I'll just pass it over to Pat.
Pat, please take the mic.
Okay, so I'm Pat Pyette. I'm the, what is my title again? Delivery lead for Pyette. As Kel said, I've been with Pyette for a while, off and on since about 2006. I think I didn't know anything about consent, and very quickly learned that not many other people did at that time either. I've spent some time being the chair of the privacy and security work group in Canada for health standards. Worked in HL7, participated as a work group member for the initial consent work that was done with messaging and with documents, and with fire consent. Participated in the HITSP privacy and security work group as well. I've been responsible for the successful delivery of Pyette's consent solution into a number of organizations, but probably most notably is at the time was called eHealth Ontario, which is now Ontario Health, which is responsible for the electronic um, the management of electronic PHI for 13.5 million folks, and our consent solution is kind of at the heart of that. So we've gone from having a functional product to having a functional, operational, kind of battle hardened product out there. So
Great.
That's me.
Great, thank you. Daniel, you want to take it? And actually, let me just ask a quick question of Kel and Pat. Do you know enough about our project, or would you like to get another minute or two of overview of it? Because Daniel can certainly provide that.
So I've taken a quick look at it. It looks like you're trying to stand up effectively what we have in the privacy suite. And a quick read of it would seem to be that you're looking to stand up something that's going to be multi-platform. So not just for healthcare IT, but then the broader public health concerns that are out there for consent
and social care as well. So social
yeah.
services as well.
And so we've seen similar language in prior state level procurements for eligibility, integrated eligibility as related to Medicaid, Medicare, where they want to start with 42 CFR and then migrate into other platforms or integrate other platforms and leverage that consent system for that. But I don't want to, if I've mischaracterized it, or if you want to please speak to it.
No, not at all. Daniel, why don't you introduce yourself and say anything you want?
Yep. Sure. Hi, I'm Dan. I'm one of the
He's the
co-founders.
Nice to meet you, boss.
Thanks. Good to have you, boss. Thanks for making the time to talk with us as well. So I'm one of the co-founders of Stewards of Change, and the work we're doing here over a bunch of years, trying to work across domains and sectors to try to really come at this work from the social services side and bring healthcare and behavioral health and education and justice into the conversation, given the impact of all of those domains and sectors on an individual or community's well-being and health. Without going into a lot of the other detail, one of the things we did last year is we brought together a national group of thought leaders really from across multiple domains to really figure out what we could do to be really useful, given the world was moving so rapidly towards a tilt environment as a result of COVID. It might be an opportunity to really think about a systemic kind of change to the way we're doing business, so to speak. Anyway, there's a lot more on that that's interesting. But one of the things that came out of this was we wanted to identify something that could be done that could actually be implemented in 21, 22, that could actually have a meaningful structural impact on the way information was shared and used to provide more coordinated care. And so one of the things that really sort of surfaced was this idea of a kind of a ubiquitous consent that was at the consumer level that they could use, they could understand, they could provide their consent and revoke their consent. Recognizing a lot of work had been happening in healthcare and to a certain degree in behavioral health. How could we port that over? How could we learn from that? And then how could we actually extend that to providing education, with similar, parents who have to provide educational for FERPA and for justice involved people and other kinds of areas as that was expanding. So this work is evolving. And one of the things that we're doing right now, which I'm sure Dan mentioned to you, is we're trying to just bring together sort of the, under a small grant from the Robert Johnson Foundation, kind of a scan of what's out there. One thing we didn't find is any kind of compendium of what are the efforts going on right now that address consent in a meaningful way. And so that's sort of the first area of business over the next 2 months to actually pull that together. And Dan has been a partner in this effort along the way, and said, well, you got to talk to these guys because they've been doing it for longer than anybody. So that's really the purpose here, is to really learn and to see what can be repurposed, what can we what can we not do, and what can we sort of build on in terms of understanding what's out there right now. So in a nutshell.
All right, so I'm going to try to get through I'm going to ask the next three folks to introduce themselves, to make it very brief if possible,
Yep.
so we can get to the question. So Tom, grab it, and then Jim.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. As I mentioned before, Tom Sylvius, I'm chairman of the board right now at Hudson Center for Healthcare Equity and Quality. I spent 20 years with the New York Medicaid program, so I'm very familiar with those initiatives. And I also participated in HITSB. I heard somebody say that back in the day. Was part of the program office there during that interface to CMS and ARC. And also a couple of years ago, I participated in another national work group called the MITA TAC. You guys are probably familiar with the acronym MITA.
Yeah.
And we did a consent proof of concept, if you will, for a Medicaid use case that crossed domains, and we leveraged a product that SAMHSA had made called Consent to Share.
Yeah.
And so those are kind of the elements from my expertise and participation.
Excellent.
Great. Jim, and then where did you go? And then Brian.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Jim St. Clair. I'm the Chief Trust Officer for Lemedic, and Lemedic has a patient identity platform known as Lemedic Connect. I'm involved in digital identity and trust, and involved in consent at the standards level. So was thrilled to be able to get involved with this initiative where we potentially map identity management into consent management, and look forward to chatting. Thank you.
Good to meet you.
And I'm Brian Spicker. I'm a technical lead for Project Unify, also one of the co-chairs of the consent working group within Project Consent Technology Working Group, as well as apparently the Consent Governance Working Group within Project Unify. I'm also Chief Technology Officer for a startup company, Open City Labs, working on the intersection between healthcare and human services.
And involving consent?
Dependent upon consent, but not delivering consent services ourselves.
And Amanda, last but not least, and then let's jump into some questions.
Yeah, hi everyone. Amanda Taylor here. I've been with Stewards of Change as a consultant for a little over a year now. Support person to Adam and Daniel and the Project Unify team in this consent work.
Great. And I think Brian and Dan both had to leave early. Is that correct? Assuming
Yes.
so, I'm going to ask Dan to maybe ask a question or two before he goes. That he thinks, you chose these Kel as an exemplar. Let's hear a little bit about the wisdom that we can gain from them. If that's okay with you, ask a question or two, and then I'm going to ask Brian if he has any questions, so that we get some of you guys' input before you have to go.
Well, Cal and Pat, if you don't mind, again, you've done this. So many people talk about this from a policy perspective, from a legal guidance perspective, from a wish list perspective. Perhaps you could just, and you talked about Ontario. I know that's just one example of your success. You've also had a few not so successful initiatives, but perhaps you could just really give us a sense of your empirical experience, right, in implementing consent, not only in Canada, but the States. You've had a few initiatives, as I recall, as well. But just give us really a sense of your scars, as well as your medals.
Financial scars?
Not those, more your implementation scars, please.
All right. So I'll give you a sense of what the product has been informed by, if I can do it that. So full disclosure, Pyette International is a Delaware corporation, and it's registered for business in Florida. There are some Canadian principles behind the scenes, and but as I indicated, we always viewed, and we started off this whole venture with a belief that we wanted to have a consent management platform that would be highly flexible in being able to adjudicate for consent, not only within states, but across states, and knowing that a number of states are going to have opt-in, opt-out, opt-in with restrictions, opt-out with exceptions, and so forth, and wanted to be as useful to the consumer, healthcare, the patient, if you will, as we could be for the organization, and honor the underlying jurisdictional legislative mandates, if I will. And so to that point, we wanted to make sure that we were involved and ready to be called upon, if you will, for what we believed would be a reasonably well-informed product. That's a long way of getting to, we basically played or supported in any of the initial ONC initiatives, if you will. So of course the AHIC use cases, consumer access to clinical information, we engaged with Holt Anderson's group in Chica, North Carolina, to the extent that we could, and with the belief that eventually the system that IBM was pulling together for them, IBM Federal, would be put to practice, if you will. At the time, I believe it was the Social Security Administration, and piping with Med Virginia and possibly Chica. That never really came to fruition after the NIN 2 Forum 5 kind of closed out in Washington in December 2008. But leading up to that, we were 2 years supporting HITSP, the Security Privacy Infrastructure, TC. Jonathan Coleman was leading a lot of that activity, or facilitating a lot of that activity. So the leveraging standards like IHE Aetna for an audit repository, and then looking around to see which standards we could use or adopt, or would make sense to be able to provide granular access control for the product. And the product originally was designed as an enterprise solution, if you will, where the enterprise could either be a state initiative, a Banner Health, or whatever system wanted to be, or even just quite simply a hospital. So we have representative deployments of that today. Unfortunately, none of them are in the United States, although they're very relevant and valid, and hard fought, if you will, to get. So we basically developed this product for 10 years before we actually got a sale, and never would have believed that that would be the case. And so you can call us fools, or we could look, pretend we're really smart right now. But anyway, here we are today. So we also, from a policy perspective, helped work with the HISPIC 3. So North Carolina was in the intra and inter use cases, if you will, that was funded under RTI International, I think, at the time. And they were also working with California. And so there was, we were honorably mentioned, if you will, in their final product in 2009. Also did some work with the VA, Mike Davis's lab in San Diego. We were, I don't know if someone's here from FEI, I know someone from FEI Systems is with your group. But we also were permitted to interact with a DS4P, the first version between SAMHSA and the VA. So the product has its ability to be able to consume that standard, if you will, although it hasn't been updated to whatever has happened beyond 2013. As far as SCARs go, I mean, we knew that we needed to develop something standards-based in an SOA-based platform. Pat can speak more directly to the standards and maybe some of the implementation SCARs, although truthfully, a lot of the time we were just waiting and sitting on our hands waiting for governance decisions to be made. Designing a system that could be flexible enough to be able to handle just about any legislative mandate or requirement, 42 CFR Part 2, whatever flavor of that, eventually, gets implemented, and just being useful that way. So a lot of our scars was waiting for governance decisions and people to take the time to decide what it is that they want. And truthfully, back in 2009 to 2013 timeframe, I could say that there was other technology companies out there that were trying to convince people in government that the technology wasn't ready for them. It wasn't ready for them even if they wanted to have it put in place. And so that was kind of frustrating for us. Not to say that we have the perfect solution, but over time, the state of Washington put out an RFI a couple months ago. And without getting in particulars, I can say, honestly, I think our product aligns with probably 85 to 90% of what it is that they're looking for. And in all honesty, here we are in 2021, and this is probably that represents probably the first straight up consent management RFI, or request for proposal ideally, that we've actually seen. Consent management has always been embedded as in public health, larger initiatives. Integrated eligibility going back to 2012 in Vermont, which they never got off the ground, and then procured for 4 years later, and it was part of a larger procurement that they had to actually not do because they didn't have the funding for it. They had to bust it up. Yeah.
Hey, Kel.
Yeah.
Quick clarifying question. You mentioned the Nationwide Health Information Network trial implementations. Did your solution make it into the Connect product that they produced at ONC?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. What had happened was IBM stood up a platform of technologies, then Initiate Systems, us, 2 or 3 others, a terminology service, all the essentials you would need for an enterprise service solution. And we were made to believe at the time that, when the curtain goes down on N2 Form 5, this is going to be operationalized in different states. But they got a new VP in, and quite honestly, they said, well, if it's not an IBM-centric product, then why can't we make it ourselves? And I don't know that they ever actually ended up doing that. As far as the NIN Connect, Pat can speak to this more directly, but I believe we're leveraging same and similar standards.
So I'm going to interrupt for a moment. I apologize. I want to see if, and it's fine if you don't, Brian, but if you have anything from your perspective that you want to ask before, I know you have to Zoom, the other definitions of, would you, do you have anything, or should we keep going?
Sure. I've got 2 basic questions.
Great.
Ask them both at the same time because unfortunately, very shortly, I have to leave to give a presentation of our project Unify to a named state, local, and tribal working group.
I apologize for taking so much time too, Brian.
No, we invited you.
No, not at all. What you've been saying is very valuable. I'm almost inclined to say, don't let me ask more questions. Just keep talking.
But it's recorded. You can listen to it later.
Yeah.
All right. So Brian, go on.
And then I'll listen to the recording later on. Yes. Number one, the first question is I'm very impressed with what appears to be a very broad set of healthcare use cases you've attempted to address with your product, and that's pretty ambitious in its own way. And was wondering if, based on your experience, attempting to address the various types of consent use cases, you had any perspective or thoughts on how similar or the same technology could be applied to consent for access to information, child welfare information, or education information, Justice Department information. The second question being, and I'm making an assumption here that your product is a proprietary product, not an open source product that you're then offering on a premium business model with some premium. But do you have any thoughts or insights into some of the open source efforts that have been done, like Consent to Care or the San Diego CDSD project? And now I'll shut up and let you get back to talking. I'm very, very fascinated by what you have to say and your experience.
So just before I hand it over to Pat, because Pat is very much, as you heard earlier, involved in standards, and there's some actually new ones, fairly new initiatives also. I mean, there's been very good work. So it's not fair for me to comment on consent to share. What I can say is the state of Washington did their own survey of consent to share and their deployments across the US and lessons learned there. So that's in the public domain and is there for you to be able to consume. And I can give you a pointer to that if you want me to. There's a lot of, okay. I think a lot of the open source work that's been done under the ONC have been done by very competent, well-meaning people. I don't know that it's been taken and as Pat had indicated, shown its ability to be battle hardened when it comes to a production environment behind firewalls, operating at high volumes, that sort of thing. So while the quality of the code might be very well there, Pat's someone who could speak more to, it's one thing to be able to build a prototype and another thing to have it actually working in a tier 4 data center that needs to be operated by the government or by, state agencies. Pat, did you have some comments that you wanted to add to this?
Not really. In terms of the consent to share or any of the open source solutions out there, that's kind of what in hindsight, that's probably what we initially came to market with, is something that was at that level of maturity in my estimation. So it's effectively a functional things. It does what it purports to do. But if you try and actually give it to somebody to operate, that's when the questions and the problems will occur. And one of the things that you can't do, and again, this is a policy-based thing, but in I think all of our implementations at this point in time, except for one, if the consent system is down, healthcare stops because if you've created a consent directive that says I've withheld my permission or my consent to disclose this information, and you go ahead and disclose it, and you've got that information, then you've got some potential liability that you've got to address. So one of the things that you cannot do, at least in some of the implementations, is to have a system that stops or is not necessarily as production or operator friendly as it needs to be.
So what's the big takeaway here? Was the technology not sufficient? Was the implementation faulty? What's the takeaway? What's the gap between the well-intentioned people who came up with seemingly usable products and the lack of ability to really make them work once somebody was trying to operationalize?
And I'm kind of embarrassed to say this because I spent the first 15 years of my career doing IT support, but it was actually more likely our I guess neglect of the IT support use cases. So we were more focused on the business use case, which is perfectly reasonable. But then it was okay. Now, how do we deploy this? How does someone that we want to hand this off to operate this? And those questions, when we were initially rolling this out back in the 2013, I guess, we hadn't necessarily asked ourselves those questions, at least, or certainly hadn't answered them to a level that we needed to. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway.
And in all fairness, if I may,
yeah,
only so much you can anticipate when you've got a product that's new in a space that is newly requiring it. Notwithstanding Pat's experience and expertise, but from a policy perspective also, and I don't know if anyone's thought of this on your end, but we made sure that there's a lot of privacy solutions out there that are audit based. and they try and perceive or come to market with the idea that they're proactively privacy. Anything that is audit related is after the fact, anything. But auditing is very important. And so to Pat's point, and one of the reasons why we leveraged the IHE ADNA profile for an audit repository was to have a standards-based accounting of events related to consent and related to access. And then the other part of it too, that we wanted to always make sure was that whether a patient comes in one day and says, I don't want anyone to see any of this information, and then a year later is compromised somehow, some way by Healthway, and all of a sudden wants the world to know what problem they have so that the world can fix it for them and come back and changes their consent. We maintain a longitudinal record, if you will, of what consent was in place at one time. And that's incredibly important, especially in any litigious society.
Yeah. Yep. There was one more thing I was going to say, and I think I've lost it. So,
but circling back, Pat, then as to the first question, I think Ryan asked was the flexibility of, say, our product, if you will, to be able to handle different use cases as it relates to public health or social determinants of health, or
sure,
particularly to the people here, Pat, items that relate to the care of a child.
Yep. Yeah. So you'd identified things like justice or child welfare. So the way we started it off was looking at collection, use, and disclosure for specific purposes of use, and it was all around PHI. So where we ended up in terms of product is we still have fundamental privacy kind of concepts. So purpose of use is a fundamental piece of this. Collection, use, and disclosure still fundamental pieces. Pretty much everything else is an attribute that we can make decisions based on. And if there's an attribute or something that's important for a use case that we don't have, then the product actually allows you to add those attributes, and as long as everybody agrees that we're going to use that in terms of making a decision, then you're in good shape. Brian, I see you have to leave, so hopefully that answered your question. In terms of the child welfare, so that's the kind of thing that we would say, okay, so there's an attribute here, and we've done things like drug court, for instance, consent. For drug court application. Didn't actually go anywhere, but we've actually thought through that process and kind of implemented at least a demo of how that might work. So multiple use cases. Again, you want to be relatively inflexible on the fundamentals of consent, on kind of the privacy pieces. So what are those concepts? And then everything else, try and make that as flexible as you possibly can. Again, it always takes, it takes two to tango. So the way that the policies are going to be written has to be relatively consistent. You can't have one kind of use case wanting to do it this way and another use case wanting to do it some other way that's totally kind of at odds with that. But there's generally, I don't think I've seen a case where we haven't been able to take a policy. This is what we want to do in terms of consent. This is what we agree to allow patients or folks to consent to or withdraw their consent from, and not be able to put that into a policy statement that's kind of cohesive, that our system understands and can adjudicate, and we can also make it kind of human readable and understandable at that point as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick clarifying question there. when, does that go for somebody mentioned earlier, this longitudinal record of consents held over time? Is
Yeah.
that accessible in the same way? Or is
Yeah.
that like protected as a log or something?
No, so it is. So you can actually say in our system, you could in theory run a request to say on this date and time I need a consent decision, or what was the consent, what would have been a consent decision for this set of attributes. So we take a look at the attributes associated with the requester, with the data that they're looking for, and was it a blue moon at the time, that kind of thing, and then we'll be able to provide the decision that would have been made at that specific date and time. So it's just a point in time architecture. There's really no magic around it, but it's kind of a standard point in time architecture that is where we never delete a record. We'll just say, this one's now terminated and replaced by this one. So, and here are some timestamps that will allow us to know when that was done and how effective, or what the effective period was for all of those previous records.
Pat,
That's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Pat. I think at one point we thought of, and I don't know if we did this, but being able to actually print out the running consent.
Oh yeah, no, so the product has, we can do policy history reports and things like that. So we can say, at any point in time or at every point in time, from its initial kind of instantiation through to its current iteration, what did the policy look like, or what did the set of consent directives look like?
So I'm going to jump in and see. I want to move it a little bit. We're going to run out of time, and I want to get at least a few of the sort of apples to apples questions that we're asking various interviewees. I want to get them covered at least at some length at some point. And with I hope with not too much inconvenience, if we have more questions, we can email them to you and we can follow up, or we can follow up.
Yeah, we're happy to have an open dialogue.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. So, do you have, rather than me asking you to really describe your solution in detail, do you have a write-up? You must, I'm guessing you do, for marketing purposes, a write-up of what is your solution, so we could, in our final report, so we can actually just summarize it?
Yeah, I mean, what I can do is, we wrote a white paper in 2009 that basically, it gives you the general sense of what it is that why we approached it the way we did, and it really hasn't changed since.
Right.
And I can give you, we're at version 6 now, but I can give you a version 5 data sheet, which will give you
Great.
If that's of value to you.
That would be of real value to us, and we could probably glean more information than just the description of your project from it as well. Do you also have use cases you can share, or yeah? That would be great. That would.
And again, going back to 2009, we've been trying to get this product implemented in the United States in a meaningful way, and so the use cases you're going to get are going to be germane, but they're not going to be from the US.
Okay, fair enough. We can hopefully we'll learn from them. Can you briefly define what the problem is that you were and are looking to solve? Can you encapsulate that?
Sure. So essentially, to provide a electronic system that would enable data governance or information governance, to put it in the highest level term, if I can say it that way.
Patient controlled.
Patient controlled, yes. But patient controlled, but with enabled by a healthcare system, state or federal system governance that has governance concerns. At a very, very high level, that's what we wanted to do. So enable something that was patient-centric, honor, whatever legislative mandates, dictated what the patient should have or what rights the patient should have, from a best practices approach, but also be, again, useful for organizations, however you wanted to define them, and operating in whichever jurisdiction they happen to be in. And then, so not only enable an access control system to be able to do that from a consent perspective, and differentiate, if I will, if I may, for anyone who's highly security centric, it's just because someone's role permits them to have access doesn't mean it's appropriate for them to have access. And that's why we try and make the distinction between security controls and privacy controls. And so no matter from a security perspective, no matter how fine-grained access you enable, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to achieve privacy. And you're not necessarily going to achieve consent management in a privacy-centric manner. And we viewed that this challenge to put in place a standards-based system to be able to do this had to be able to plug and play in an enterprise service bus kind of technology platform at the time. There was no cloud. And it needed to be useful not just in the US, Canada, but in the UK or Holland or wherever. Western society decided that patients should have some kind of control, rightly or wrongly, of who has access to their most sensitive information. And so there was lots of challenges. Number one, and Pat helped us with a lot of this as well, choosing how do we architect the product? How do we make it so that it can most easily plug into a then HP or IBM platform? How can it work with, if it needed to, with EMRs or EHRs? Just, you wouldn't believe the challenges in just making it as flexible as you could. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Yeah. So I noticed that there's someone on the call that looks at patient identity, and I will tell you that if you can't solve that problem, yeah, hi Jim, if you can't solve that problem, you can't get here. You've got to get the patient identity issue resolved before you can think about consent.
Yeah, further to Pat's point, consent management is only going to work if there's a source of truth for patient identity and a source of truth for the providers of care. Those two have to be in place or you can't achieve consent management.
I agree with you guys 100% and have been kind of exploring here with the team about, from our perspective, Lomedic, that identity in and of itself supports privacy and consent around, or there is privacy and consent around your identity attributes, and building an identity system that allows me to say, I'm Jim, I'm only going to tell you I'm Jim, and here's my verification to prove that, because I don't want to share other details, which again is a very GDPR type focus idea. And how consent is then an extensible aspect of identity, where you may have and this by no means reflects on your system, and presuming you're still using a XACML-based kind of AVAC approach to things. But you may implement a system where you're making granular consent decisions about data elements associated with a patient's record. But if it requires the patient to disclose information about their identity, or they're not willing to disclose their identity, or they'll say, I'm willing to disclose this, this, and this about myself, and if you want consent for this third item, that's fine, but I'm only now going to tell you two things about myself. So maybe there's aspects of substance use disorder that I'm willing to disclose in a consent management system, but in doing so, I'm not willing to disclose my gender or disclose the fact that I'm homeless. And so how do I work with that multidimensional concept of both the identity attributes, the consent management model, and then how privacy affects both of them? So I think we're probably all on the same page together.
Oh, absolutely. Jim, I don't know whether you're aware of it, but I don't know whether you're familiar with Direct Trust, but they're looking at consumer credentials now, so identity for consumers. So it might be something that you want to tap into. They were just I was just at a policy meeting just before this one. So
Yeah, Patrick, I'd love to have a separate conversation and tell you philosophically the world that we come from and international standards around identity that is based on distributed identity and not federated identity models, and why federated in some respects isn't, say, GDPR compliant, and the differences there. And direct trust is great. Care and Alliance is great, but I've been trying to share with both that there's a different direction, especially when you get to consent and privacy, that you have to have more of an abstracted ability to control those identity elements than federated identity supports.
Right. I'd love to do that. Absolutely.
Let's try and set something up.
Happy you're both on the call. So before we again watch the clock, I'm going to hand it to Daniel. And Daniel, if I can, I'm going to have one or two last questions, but I want to make sure you're.
Yep. I keep coming back to, well, I guess two questions come to mind, but the main question is, as we look at trying to create a mechanism for, say, education, you know, there's something as simple as identifying or reporting school attendance on a daily basis. One of the biggest indicators of, you know, safety, health, and well-being, whether the kids in school or not. And right now, we believe that in order to get that outside of the school, you know, sort of environment ecosystem, you're going to need a consent. And right now, that looks like, you know, putting a Xerox copy or a mimeograph sheet in the kid's backpack, if you remember those, and have them, you know, have parents sign and bring it back, and somebody probably types it in or something like that. But we're thinking about, you know, so there's some very rudimentary things that just, you know, sort of gum up the works. That just one example of how the, you know, the sophisticated approach that you've taken does that. What are the lessons learned to apply it in that environment? Can you port those lessons? Can you port those technologies into an environment like that doesn't have clinical, you know, meds, you know, numbers, those kinds of things?
Are you familiar with MyHin and the work that they're doing and have been doing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We wish they would have used our system instead of slowly creeping into making their own. But back in 2012 timeframe, they were recognizing in leaders, at least at the state level, of finding a way to get one sheet or one page of information that was specific enough for consent, but met all of many needs, not just of the health system, but the judicial system, this system, that system. And it took them a year of a very coordinated effort. You know, things that the courts would recognize, you know, just all these different use cases that have not necessarily anything to do with health necessarily, or may have a lot to do with health, that every state agency, if you will, could buy into. And again, it took them a year to do it, but they came up with one that everyone could agree upon, and then they got the state legislature to pass the mandate, if you will. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. But if you could imagine it, it's only, well, and I'm not trying to overcomplicate it, because you theoretically, you could get one going and then you could gain some traction and then modify it later and make it adjustments. And then I think someone like Pat would say at that particular time, then you're just making changes to the user interface and how you're capturing it. Have I oversimplified that, Pat?
No, I don't think so. But I think the original, Daniel, your original question was around, you know, is the technology transferable? That is, can you take what's been out there and start to apply it to that, for, as an example, that particular use case, the school attendance one.
Right.
I'm not sure that you can or you should at this point in time, just because technology keeps moving on. There, you know, people people are in business of thinking up new ways of doing and hopefully better ways of doing the same thing or doing other things. But the concepts don't change. So those are transferable, absolutely. So once again, I'll go back to the identity piece. You know, is it that mimeograph sheet that you've got somebody's signature on? Well, you know, how do you know it's the parent's signature? Or you don't, right? So what level of trust are you going to verify these things at? I mean, these are all questions that you're going to need to answer, or somebody's going to need to answer to say, then once those questions are answered, then you can say, okay, what technology will help us get to where we need to go? But I think the first questions are things around what do we trust, what don't we trust? What's the minimum level that we need in order to make this work effectively? That would be kind of the place I would start with.
Yeah.
Daniel, anything else? I'll take this one.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. But sorry, but before I do, Jim, anything else from you? I want to make sure everybody gets it.
No, I'm all good, and I'll follow up with them separately.
Yeah, the
Okay,
one thing, one little thing I just to put in Jim's mind is the identity piece, which is something that Dan also reinforced very clearly, was we're looking at different ways of probably federated identity management, because now you've got a school system, you've got a, you know, behavioral health clinic, you've got, you know, a court, you've got something else here. We're going to need to, while you might have an integrated eligibility or enrollment form, a couple of places have done that, you still need to know that that person is the same person in those different systems providing their consent. So not to answer that necessarily, Jim, but I think that's the part of the problem, part of the challenge here is making sure we're getting the same person when we're trying to link those things together.
Absolutely. And yeah, and we have a new privacy new patient identity IG that we're working on for HL7. And we were just talking about that today. And it's really just a question of, well, I won't distract. I won't take up the time now. No, Alan's got some other questions.
We'll follow up with that. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment about that. You also want to allow for individuals to decide that they want to have multiple identities.
Yep, that's exactly right. It requires rethinking in terms of what verification of an identity means and what that identity means for the specific
really
interaction that you're validating for, and allow the individual the freedom that they don't have to be the same identity in every case and force them to share those identity attributes every time.
Can we convince them that they're making our lives more difficult with that decision and they should only have one identity? No, just so you guys have talked about the technology some and policy as well. Can you speak, this may not be your bailiwick, but can you speak to the legal aspects of what you've had to accomplish and what maybe the hurdles are, or what you've learned, or what you think works? Any way you want to answer it, but get to the question of the legal aspects of it, because we know that those are significant.
Pat, do you want to, is there anything that comes to mind as it relates to, do you mean legal? So let me maybe sharpen this a little. From an implementation perspective, what kind of legal?
Legally, I mean, there are legal issues that you have to surmount, right? There are lawyers involved in the work that you do. Getting people to actually implement with your very name HIPAA raises the question.
Okay, so nothing. Well, for me, nothing is top of mind, and as ridiculous as that sounds, I want to explain why then real quick. When we're brought in, a lot of decisions have already been made, and it's not our role to say you can't do that. It's our role, and at least has been in the past, to operationalize whatever governance and whatever legal vehicles have decided needs to be implemented. So we may choose, and I think Pat has actually done this at least once, suggest like if they want to approach something a certain way, or if they decided, or a work group has decided that it should be implemented a certain way, you know, highlight that, well, isn't it your law that, you know, might raise a concern, or there's a peripheral item here that might have been overlooked. But Pat, is there anything beyond that from your experience?
No, I don't think so. We don't. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Kel. We don't come in and advise on the kind of the legality or the policy that should be in place. We try and advise on if they're still trying to establish policy, on what those alternatives might be and what the ramifications of them are. I know I've done that with privacy folks in the past, but fundamentally the policy is based on whatever the jurisdiction or the organization that's paying our salary basically is going to deal with.
Let me, if I can, just give a short nugget, if I can. I'll call it a nugget. I don't know if it is or not, or how golden it is, but we supported the, and we're involved with the data segmentation for privacy pilot, the initial one between VA and Samsung. And, but it was not clear to me, at least from a business perspective, how that particular standard might see any kind of uptake or not. And I was at a MyHIN conference in 2012, 2013, and I had occasion to have a moment of time with the CEO, the then CIO of Henry Ford Health. And I asked her what she thought of that standard, and the fact that somebody could present at the behavioral health side of their facility, enact some privacy controls, and then represent another time with a broken arm at the physical side of the enterprise. And the physical side of the enterprise would maybe not know the totality of their condition. And she was dead set against it. She didn't like it, she didn't support it, and she never would. So I don't know if that helps you from a policy perspective, but from a operational perspective, there was just no way she would ever allow that to happen.
So we have just a minute left. What I want to ask you is a real softball, but an important one. You've done this for a long time. That's why you're here, right? What's the you have some sense of the work that we're trying to accomplish here? Is there a big lesson learned? You know, what we know now is X and Y, and that's really good for you to know as a starting point. Or, you know, we screwed up royally 10 years ago, then you don't want to. Is there any big lesson learned? And it's fine if not, but if there is, it's a good place for us to start.
I mean, nobody's perfect. I would just say that I'd be able to answer that on behalf of our group better is if we were indeed included with, you know, a couple of the integrated eligibility deployments that were made. I know that, you know, we were with primes, if you will, like a Wipro or a CGI or an Accenture or a Deloitte, as part of an overall solution of which we were the ones to be able to handle the consent. I'd say 4 out of the 5 I just mentioned, they never got the business, so we didn't get the business. They had, you know, some other group working on it, and often the consent part of it was like, well, we'll build that out when we get there. There's just way too much other stuff to do ahead of time, such as source of truth for identity, source of truth for, you know, whoever the role is in that organization and who the patient is. So beyond that, I don't have anything to throw back at you.
Okay, that's fine.
So the only thing I would, you know, just, and this is not necessarily based on my experience rolling out consent, but just in general, is take one use case, implement the one use case, get it working, and learn your lessons from that and move on to the next one, rather than trying to kind of boil the ocean. It's a softball answer to your softball question, but that certainly in my mind is something that you want to do.
We'll take it. We'll take it. All right, Daniel, anybody else?
Well,
before-
I have one other question that may be, well, let me just put it out there, may need to come back at it or put it down for you. Been having some conversations about whether or not if NIST provided, from a legal perspective, if they provided a standard against which the privacy officer would say, okay, if you hit those standards, we're okay with it. Because oftentimes what you hear is, what's the standard, especially on the non-healthcare stuff? What's the standard that we're trying to achieve in terms of security or access or identity management? And because there aren't defined standards, there oftentimes the answer is no. And the question is that to flip it around, and actually San Diego was thinking about this for a while, some of the folks on the county side, which is say if there was a defined NIST standard or level of standards, would that make privacy easier or probably not the best for us, but would it make it viable? Because now there's an external third party entity that's that's respected and believed to be.
So are you familiar with 800-53?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit, but not.
So
not-
they have it's now 4 or 5 years old, but it was then new. Appendix J, I think it is.
Of R4, Appendix J of R4 is the privacy controls.
There you go.
Yep.
And that would give you, I would imagine that if I was trying to stand something up, I would be looking to that to at least say, if I can meet this, then I probably don't have too many holes in the system.
And
And
do you
I
think
would
that
throw
be
out-
would that be
Dave,
relevant across areas as well, or is that more still healthcare focused?
And it's across, it's a more of a federal standard for information systems overall. Daniel, it's not
Okay,
specific to any domain.
okay.
There's also, Pat, there's that ISO standard we came across a while
Yeah.
ago.
29184 and I think it's 27560, and they're both part of privacy and consent receipt.
There you go.
Cal, the NIST standard that you're talking about, or that special publication, is that the privacy framework? Because I believe that they've just published a new. It might just be an update. I don't.
Oh no, not the framework. I know what you're speaking to now. I wasn't speaking to that one. No, Pat.
Yeah. So there's one. I don't know whether it's relatively new or whether it's just I've been tracking the iterations, the draft iterations. But there's a NIST has published again. It's an SP series. Which is a privacy framework. So I think it covers not only technical controls, but there's administrative policy issues, all of that kind of good stuff. So I think that you might want to have a look at that as a good place to start.
Is that a
I can
is that a
send
silver
you.
bullet?
I can send you a link to that because I've got to follow up on 3 or 4 items.
That would be great. Is that a potential silver bullet on some of this?
I think it's a potential guiding star.
Okay.
I don't think there's a silver bullet.
Okay.
We'll take any cliche we can get.
Great.
All right. Anybody, anything else? And I'll let everybody get out of here. Right. Thank you so much. This was terrific. This really was. Pat, thank you so much for participating in this. And I'll send Dan a little thank you for turning this on to you.
Wonderful. We appreciate the opportunity. And if you want to continue the dialogue sometime, or gosh darn it, if you want to use our product, we're happy to have it happen.
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things we will do is we will include in this report, in the scan, sort of the resources, people we've spoken with, and try to highlight those things. So what we want to avoid is just sort of duplicating, if at all possible. So to the degree that that's valuable, we'll and it's under the RWJ imprimatur, might be of value out there, at least to point at it, hopefully.
And we appreciate that.
Yeah, and you're going to send me some information so I can write this up properly.
Shall I just reply back to the distribution list?
I don't know if everybody needs it or wants it, but certainly.
Well, I can just send it to you, Adam.
Yeah, that's great. And I can certainly, and I will share it, and then it'll wind up in the report anyway.
I don't want to take anyone's time.
Thank you again. wherever you guys are, have a very good rest of your afternoon or evening.
All right, stay healthy.
Hey, thanks.
All right,
Take care.
Take care all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
again.